Welcome to Excel in Case Interviews. This is a video focused on some guidance about individual preparation for the case interview process, how you can practice specific areas and skills to be successful in case interviews. Our topic here is about market sizing. My name is Pam Schilling, and I'm the CEO and career strategist with Arch Career Partners. I have a background in strategy consulting and technology leadership, and today I focus on helping individuals prepare for interviews and opportunities with some of the most selective hiring organizations. I also have a particular specialty in the case interview process. Solo practice is one of the key parts of case preparation. There's only so much you can do practicing with a partner. This video in particular is going to talk about market sizing, which is one of the key concepts and areas within many case interviews. Let's discuss a little bit about the market sizing practice activity and to give some context about market sizing problems in general. Why is this an area of attention and where you should be placing time and energy in your practice? Well, number one, this could actually be a specific element of one of your case interviews, whether it's the case itself or a component of the case for some sort of strategy question about market entry or growth. But there's also some big benefits to practicing market sizing. It builds your structuring skills because there does need to be an organizing approach to the market size problem. It's also important to help build logic and reasoning skills. You need to be able to explain your rationale and assumptions that you make during the market sizing question. It's also an area where you have to be creative. And so thinking about how you go from a population to a particular number, sometimes you have to be thoughtful and think a little bit out of the box. And finally, you have to prioritize. This is something where there's so many different things that you could potentially look at and so many layers and so many opportunities to break apart a problem, but that's not the intent of the market sizing question. It's really to look at things with a high level order of magnitude. And so if you can't prioritize what's important and what's not, you can run into challenges. As you approach market sizing, there could be some challenges in your way just given the background that you have or the type of experience potentially. And these are just things to work on in your preparation and be aware of. So number one, there's certain pieces of information that you want to have easily accessible. I'm not necessarily talking about memorizing, I'm thinking more about familiarity, but there's going to be certain facts or areas of understanding that you should have. I'll talk about those shortly. Also, if you've not been in a role where you've had to do a lot of estimation, this could just be unfamiliar territory. On the other hand, if you've been in a role where you've had to do very detailed work, things like engineering and academic research and science, as well as even business areas like accounting, again, this could be something that you're just not that comfortable with, so practicing it is very important. There's a lot of different resources where you can go to for market sizing problems. Some of the books that have been written by consulting experts, as well as the Consulting Club casebooks, which you can find both online as well as specific online resources that deal with market sizing problems. There's also a nice tool out there called Rocket Blocks, which has market sizing questions. But really, anything could be market sizing practice. Take a look around you in the room that you're in when you're out one day for dinner or driving or shopping, and really ask yourself, I wonder how many of that item people buy during the course of a year. That's a market sizing problem. And then the nice thing is you can actually do an online search and you might be able to find an answer for that question. I mentioned a little bit one of the challenges is to know certain types of facts or pieces of information. And let me just take a minute to highlight where some of the areas are that you're going to want to pay attention to. My recommendation is that you do a little bit of research and you actually create a set of notes, whether it's note cards or a page of notes, and you have an ability to go back and reference this during your whole case interview preparation period. Things that are important are populations, and you should really think about where you are. You should know the geography of the city that you're in, the country that you're in, if you're in the United States, different states, and also the regions that surround you or the major regions of the world. You don't have to know the exact population, but you should have a pretty good rough number. The other thing is how to break down a population into households. And that's just a way that you can use a different type of a metric to help you in some of your estimation. It's good as well to know the breakdown of populations by age and what are the typical age groups. Another area to think about is GDP. So, what are some of the major GDP values of big, large countries and maybe some of the smaller, more familiar countries, as well as general GDP growth rates? It can also be good to know the names of major currencies, and if you have a rough idea of some of the exchange rates, that could be beneficial. And then finally, if you have an opportunity, looking at the difference between metrics versus traditional standards of measures, sometimes that can come in handy. One of the focus areas that you could be thinking about in this area for your market sizing are a couple of key takeaways for these types of problems. Let me share a few thoughts. So, one, your market sizing should be simple but have the right kind of depth. We're not talking about the kind of a problem that you necessarily need to have a spreadsheet to be able to work on, but yet you've got to have enough depth in it that you build in some of the particular nuances or interesting buying behaviors or considerations that go into taking a population down to a particular unit volume. Secondly, you really need to think about the rationale or support of your estimates and assumptions. Try to understand what the basis is and be able to explain that. In addition, you really want to represent the reality of the question. You're trying to think about what would go on in the real world with a degree of magnitude. Another consideration, and sometimes we don't think about this when we talk about market sizing, very much like a case structure, it also needs to be MECE, mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. One of the best things to do is think about a market sizing as an organization chart, and no two groups have overlap. That's the ME part. And then the comprehensively exhaustive is that you've considered the factors, the most relevant, highly prioritized factors to the buying decision or the characteristics of the group that's the focus of the market sizing. Finally, just remember that market sizing is about reasoning, not math. You're the one putting together the estimates. Make sure you round the numbers and don't make things complicated from a calculation standpoint. But really, at the end of the day, the interviewer is trying to make sure that you have good logic and rationale. For the next portion of this video, I'm going to give a couple of examples of market sizing problems. This is an opportunity for you to work through the problem, pause, and then review my explanation of how I've thought about the market sizing question and the approach and the rationale that I've taken. Now again, when I provide those solutions, that doesn't mean that that's the only answer. It just happens to be the logic and the flow that I thought would work best for the problem. There could be other alternatives, but you want to make sure that you're reasonably close. So my recommendation for this section is to hear the prompt, pause the video, take a little bit of time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes to work the market sizing problem, and then press play to continue on and hear the explanation. So let me start with the first example. In our first market sizing problem, painting profits, I want you to estimate the number of face paintings that could be done each year at the Lincoln Park Zoo. The Lincoln Park Zoo happens to be located in the city of Chicago in one of the neighborhoods called Lincoln Park. It's visited typically by not only residents of the city of Chicago and the surrounding areas, but many tourists as well that come to visit the city. As some background, the zoo is open 365 days a year, but definitely because of the weather in Chicago, the busiest season is May through October. Typically, there are 5 face painting locations around the zoo. And as a particular note, admission to the zoo is free, although many people do have memberships as a way to contribute to the zoo. And if you're not sure what a face painting is, I happen to have a photograph in the middle of the page. And what that just shows is that these are typically animal faces, either a full animal or the face of an animal, typically painted onto the individual. Most often it's children. If you like, pause the video at this point, take a few minutes to solve this question, and restart, and I'll have my explanation. And remember, you're looking for the number of face paintings potentially that could be done each year. Now that you've had a chance to work this calculation, let me share a little bit of the approach that I took when putting together this market sizing. So I really broke this down into two layers. One has to do with the number of visitors. So how many people on an annual basis are visiting the Lincoln Park Zoo? Then, in the second layer, I thought about how many of those visitors are actually purchasing a face painting. So, some assumptions that I've made based on some things that I might have known or might have researched in the past since I happen to live in Chicago. I would use the population of the city of Chicago, and I'd probably focus more on the city than the metro area just because I'm breaking it into two groups. One is the city residents, the other would be, in general, tourists. And for the tourists, I might have used a number that I had heard in the press, or maybe I just thought about the volume of people that I observe coming down Michigan Avenue or through O'Hare on an annual basis. But I would use some number, whether it's 25 million or 50 million, it really wouldn't matter in the perspective of the interviewer as long as you have a good rationale for it. Then I think about how many people of that population might make a visit. Well, the resident of Chicago is very familiar with the Lincoln Park Zoo, so that number I would say is going to be fairly high. For tourists, it might be a little bit off the beaten path, not the thing that they're typically coming here to do amongst all the other great activities, so I use a very small percentage. The other thing that I take into consideration is how many times that people go and visit per year. So, as somebody who has lived in the city of Chicago, I thought a little bit about myself and my friends and what I know about people who tend to live in the city and their visits, so I would use that number. And then I'm thinking that as tourists, when they're coming, they're only coming once a year. So this then gives me total number of visitors that I would add together from each of those two groups. Now in my area of the quantity of face painting, so of that population, how many people actually purchase a face painting? I've thought about this in two different groups. One is the percent of adults, the other is the percentage of kids. And my thinking is that probably kids have a different behavior than adults might, that face painting maybe is a little bit more popular with children. And so I've broken that population for ease of calculation about 50-50. Then on the side of adults, I break it down between men and women because in my thinking, maybe women are more interested in having face painted. Maybe it's moms visiting with their kids, or just in general, women enjoy makeup a little bit more. It could be an assumption just based on my own experience, but I've thought about that a little bit. And so I've adjusted the percent of interested parties in face painting a little bit differently between men and women. And then I've also made that interest level much higher for children. And so when I do that math, I get about 73,000 and some for kids, and then a much smaller number for the adult population. Now, one note, I'm obviously presenting this in a spreadsheet. For you, when you're doing this, you can certainly round these numbers and round them into whole numbers that makes your calculation much easier. You could tell the interviewer what you might do more specifically, but when you actually do the math, I would use a round number. And so I get roughly to 74,000 total potential face painters or interested people in face painting on an annual basis. And so depending on my question, if my question has to do with, is this a good business to be in? Or why is the business not doing well? I'd be able to use this potential number as some point of comparison. The other thing that sometimes people will do is a more operationally oriented analysis. So there's some pros and some cons to doing this. So here I call this a bottoms-up check. And so another approach to the market sizing for this particular problem might be based on actually how many face paintings could we do given the opening hours and quantities that we have around the zoo on an annual basis. So if we presume that the core operations of the zoo are in an 8-hour day and they can do about 8 face paintings per hour, that's a little less than, it's probably 6 minutes, 5 minutes per painting per person. And then there's 5 stations around the zoo. And then I'm really focused on that core period of May through October, which are the busy months at the zoo. If I take all this together and do the math, this would give me a check figure of about 64,000 face paintings per year, which is pretty close to my estimate of 74,000. Now, one of the reasons why I don't like to do this first is because this is more of an operations-based analysis than a top-down market sizing. And so just in the context of a strategy interview, you're trying to think a little bit macro. And so starting with a population is maybe a slightly better route, but certainly you could do one or the other, or even both, to show a reconciliation. Okay, I'm going to talk about the next example, and then it might be another great opportunity to pause and work this market sizing problem before I provide some explanation. So we're focused on a business called Undercover Softly. And for our question, we want to estimate the number of new pairs of socks sold in the United States each year. A few things that might help with this question. One, let's assume socks, not nylons or tights. Let's assume that it's both men and women, and that it's all different kinds of socks: dress socks, casual socks, sports socks. We're not going to think about medical use socks, things like compression socks. And also, your answer should be the number of pairs of socks, not the individual socks themselves. If you like, pause now and take a few minutes to estimate the number of new pairs of socks sold in the United States each year. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the approach to this problem. So I broke this problem down into two types of socks. New socks purchased just for the enjoyment of having new socks, and then replacement socks purchased. My thinking is that periodically people get a hole in their sock, and socks wear out. They get thin, and so the existing socks that you have to replace those. So there's a few different ways that you could do this. So one would be to take the people in the United States, the population, which you could estimate at 320 million, 350 million, whatever number, sort of easier for you to work with. And then I thought a little bit about the average new socks purchased per year. And this was just some thinking from my own experience and thinking about the people around me when I go shopping and those in my family. How often do they have new socks? Now, you could also break the people down into male versus female and have slightly different buying habits for men versus women. You could also do this by age, and maybe people that are younger have more socks because they wear them out faster. There's a couple of different ways that you could take the population and add a little bit more granularity. Then for the replacement socks, you would again take the population of the United States and think about, on average, how many pairs of socks do people own? Well, one thing would be to look in your closet and think about this. And then remember that you could sit on the high side or the low side, so finding an average. Then you could estimate the average life of a sock. How long does a pair of socks last, whether it's getting a hole or a sock getting lost? And again, you might want to use a more round number. Maybe you think it's 4 years or 6 years, so 5 might be a nice average number. This would then tell you how many socks are replaced in any given year. And then you would add the number of new socks plus the number of replacement socks together, and that would give you the total annual socks purchased in 1 year. So this sock problem, I think, is a nice reminder that there's a number of market sizing problems where you're dealing with replacements. If you think about things that last maybe more than a week, more than a month, more than a year, those are all the types of things that you're going to have to replace, whether it's tires on your car or light bulbs or socks in this case, anything that there is just a natural period of replacement. This is the way that you would want to approach it. You're typically going to have two different buckets, the new and the replacement, and then you really want to think about the average life of that particular good. All right, let's look at our third example. Here we want to estimate the annual profit of Burgers on the Fly, and if Burgers on the Fly was operating out of the Midway Airport. So the Midway Airport happens to be an airport here in Chicago, where I live. Now, this particular type of market sizing question, you would have to have some details. It's very difficult to make really good, reasonable estimates because of the specificity of the question. So let's say that Burgers on the Fly is kind of a takeout hamburger restaurant. They're typically operating in airports, so they have some familiarity. And then you'd need to know some details about the Midway Airport in Chicago. So that would be provided to you by the interviewer, and I'll provide that information now. Number one, Midway is open every day of the year. Their typical hours of operation are 4 a.m. to 12 a.m., so basically 20 hours a day. There are 40 gates at Midway. There are, on average, 1 plane per hour per gate. Each plane, on average, has about 150 passengers, and typically about 2/3 of the seats are filled. On average, there's about $10 of profit per order that Burgers on the Fly generates in its operations, and their variable costs are 80% of sales, with fixed cost of $200,000 for rent and $250,000 for royalties that they would pay to Midway Airport. It could also be beneficial to know that there are 4 other food vendors at Midway currently. So our attention is to figure out the annual profit of Burgers on the Fly. Here you might want to take an opportunity to pause the video and to work this problem. So let's think a little bit about how to do this type of market size. So the first part of this problem is figuring out actually how many people might buy a burger at the Burgers on the Fly at the Midway Airport. Then we can add in all of the other information about profitability. So there's really 2 different populations that I could see being a customer of Burgers on the Fly. One population would be the passengers that are coming through the airport. The other population would be the employees of the airport. And so I'd need to figure that out. Then what I can do for the passenger analysis is I can take some of the information that I've been given, and then I can calculate how many passengers are coming through, and then how many of them might be eating at the airport, and then how many of them might be eating at our burger restaurant. So I start with some of the information about how many gates and how many planes and how many hours per day, and this tells me how many planes per day. Then I know how many people each plane holds and how full they are, and this gives me passengers per plane. Then, given the planes per day and the passengers per plane, I know how many people are coming through Midway on a daily basis. Then what I might do is figure out what percentage of people actually eat at the airport, and of those who eat, what percentage of them might come through our burger restaurant. And these might be based on, again, observations, trying to be conservative, etc., etc. Then I have some of the information about employees. So I might ask the interviewer if I need to estimate employees or if they have that information. And the interviewer probably is going to give that to me. Then I might have a sense of how many of them actually eat at the airport, and again, what percentage of them would eat at our burger restaurant. Once I have that, then I know how many passengers in total are eating and how many employees are eating, and then I can apply some of the financial information that I've been given. So on average, I make $10 per transaction, and I have a 20% profit margin, and that would tell me how much profit per day, and then I can multiply that times 365. I might be overestimating that each day has an equivalency, and I could explain that to the interviewer. And then I would do that same analysis of employees. This would give me the annual profits. So now I can summarize. So I will have the total profit based on variable costs from my prior page, and then I will have those fixed costs, And from that, I can calculate the annual profit that Burgers on the Fly might generate as part of an opportunity to open a location at Midway Airport. So this problem is a little bit of a different type of market size where some of the information is being given to me and I have to figure out how to organize that information and how to apply it. But I'm still doing some estimating because I have to really understand how many people might be eating at the airport and then how many people might actually come to our restaurant versus others. So it still fits in the category of market sizing. So as you can see, there's a variety of different type of market sizing problems. So once you've practiced the market sizing, we go back to one of our themes, which is reviewing your feedback. So in this case, if you take a look at the work that you did and compare it to some of the solutions or the approaches that I presented, and then ask yourself, what's different and why? And based on that understanding, then you can go through and figure out what additional drills or areas of review you should be pursuing. So if you don't know a lot about the restaurant business, if you don't know a lot about the airline industry, it might not be a bad idea to do a little bit of reading on that. If you don't have a sense about replenishment, it might be a good idea to do 3 or 4 specific market sizing problems that have a typical standard period of replenishment. So again, this allows you to focus your practice. So now that you've gone through this activity and a couple of examples, let me just talk about how you might put this into action. So if you go out and you have some of those case books, find 3 to 6 cases that have some sort of a market sizing problem with a solution. Work 3 cases and focus just on the market size, and then review the solution, much like we did here, but you're obviously going to be doing that in your notes, and then figure out what you've included versus the solution, what's missing, and what kind of a gap. Then figure out what your study areas are. Focus on the 1 or 2 big things. Is it a factoid? Is it some sort of industry knowledge? Is it a product knowledge? Is it some sort of customer behavior? Figure that out and then do a little bit of reading or review in those areas, and that will really help you solidify some of the knowledge bases that you're going to need to be successful in market sizing. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video and discussion of market sizing. Please check out the additional videos on other areas of case practice.